Okay, I want to welcome everybody tonight to Diving Deeper. We're going to be in the book of Genesis, chapter number 19. And so, why don't we go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you for our time together this evening. I pray for minds that are ready and alert. Help us to learn from your word. Help us to see your character, your principles, and your word just come to life. Lord, we love you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we're going to continue with our Genesis Bible study. And tonight we're going to be in chapter number 19. And basically this is an overflow of what we seen last week in chapter number 18. It's a continuation of the same story. And it changes scenes, but it basically is the furthering of what was introduced in chapter number 18. So let's go ahead and begin reading here in verse number 1. It says, "And there came two angels to Sodom at evening." Now, this is the first time that we have these two being introduced as angels. If you'll remember in chapter 18, you had Yahweh and these two angels who came to Abraham and stayed with him long enough to eat a meal and kind of relax in the heat of the day. And it was said that they were men. The narrator informed us that one of those men was Yahweh himself, embodied in what appeared to be a human form. Now, it tells us here in verse 1 that the other two men that were with Yahweh when they visited Abraham are angels, angelic beings, divine beings, but they have an appearance of man. And we'll see that as we continue to read through this narrative. So basically, you had Yahweh who stayed with Abraham as Abraham interceded for Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain with the discourse, "Oh, Lord, far be it from you that you destroy the righteous with the wicked. If there be 50 righteous there, will you spare the city?" And the Lord agrees, and he gets the Lord to come all the way down to finding 10 righteous people. And once they came to that agreement, the Lord left, and then we jump into chapter 19, which is what we're reading. So the two angels come to Sodom. Remember, they left early. They come to Sodom in the evening. Now, if you want to look at our map here, you can see that, remember, they were down here at what is called Hebron in the plains of Mamre, or under the oaks of Mamre. And they would have essentially came somewhere to this mountainous area. If you've been to Israel, this is a mountain range right here, the Judean mountains. And it overlooks what is today the Dead Sea. But if you'll remember back when we looked at the story in Genesis chapter 14 of the kings of the east that came against these cities of the plain, you will see that the word plain there was kikar, which literally means like a circle area. And it was a very lush area, and that's why Lot chose to live in the plain. So what we see now in the Dead Sea, which is very dead and barren, at one time likely was a very lush place where there was a lot of vegetation that would sustain livestock, and the destruction of the cities in this plain likely is what resulted in what we see as the Dead Sea. And we'll see that as we read along, but I just wanted to point out kind of the area that we're looking at. We don't know the exact location of Sodom and Gomorrah, but right here, the Dead Sea, I believe it's to the north. A lot of scholars believe it's to the south. We can't prove either way. But if you'll go back to some of the prior lessons that we went through in Genesis, you'll see some of the reasons why I believe that the northern carries a little more weight on the likely location. So it says, "And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground." He had learned valuable lessons from Abraham. He had learned how to be hospitable, and he greets these individuals. Now, Lot doesn't know they're angels. Kind of like Abraham didn't know that it was Yahweh and two angels at first. They just assume because of their appearance that they're strangers that are coming. And so they do the hospitable, loving your neighbor kind of thing to do. And that's to greet them and to say in verse 2, and he said, "Behold now, my lords," which would be like sir today, "turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and you shall rise up early and go on your ways." Before we read anymore, what is noteworthy is the fact that he is at the city gate means that he is a prominent individual in that community. Because at the city gate is where you would have the leaders of the city there who would conduct the affairs and the business of the city. So Lot was at this point somewhat of an important figure in Sodom, and that's why he's there to greet them. Now, what he does immediately, I believe, will be further explained as we read through the narrative, because he asks them, and it seems almost hurried. Basically, "Turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house." Basically, come into your servant's house, and stay the night, wash your feet, and you shall rise up early and go on your way. Now remember, this was evening time, right? So it's likely dark. They had been with Abraham in the afternoon in the heat of the day. So they made a trip, if you'll go back to the map, from the plains here, or the Oaks of Mamre, over to the area somewhere in here in just a few hours. What's important about that is, if you understand the geography in the land of Israel, is if they went to the north, if the cities were located at the north, then it would be approximately 15-20 miles, depending on where. But if the cities of the plain were in the south, it would be twice that far. Okay, either way, you're going to have angels that kind of kick into turbo gear to get there before the sun goes down. So it shows that the angels rely on their extraterrestrial powers. Pardon the ET language, but that's essentially what it was. They are not bound to the laws of gravity, even though they appear to be humans. It would be very similar to what we see in the gospel narratives when Jesus is resurrected, and he can eat and do things like a normal human, but he can also walk through walls, appear, disappear, and things like that. So just a glimpse of what we have to look forward to when we trade these mortal bodies in for immortal bodies, right? So at the latter part of verse 2, it says, but watch their response, which we can only guess why they respond this way. And they said, "No, but we will abide in the street all night." Now that just doesn't sound like a way that you would reply to someone who has offered to be hospitable to you. Obviously, they're going to offer you a meal. They're going to offer you refreshments. They're going to wash your feet. They're going to give you a place to sleep overnight. And they say, "No, we're going to stay in the street all night." But watch what happens in verse 3. "And he pressed upon them greatly," which in the Hebrew means to urge them very vehemently, very adamantly. "And they turned in unto him and entered his house, and he made them a feast," which is exactly what we've seen that Abraham did. He goes and prepares a meal, "and did bake unleavened bread, matzot, and they did eat." So these angels have been fed a meal already, a big feast by Abraham, and now they're in Lot's house and they're eating again. But watch how the story takes a twist here in verse 4. "But before they lay down, the men of the city," the men of Sodom, "compassed the house round, both old and young." So all the men of the city find out that two men, or at least that's what they think, two men have come to Lot's house, and they surround the house, and it says both old and young, all the people from every quarter. So they surrounded the house. And verse 5 says, "And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came in to you this night. And watch what is said. Bring them out unto us that we may know them. So you have the men, young and old, from every quarter of the city, surround the house, and they demand to Lot that the two men that are in his house be brought out so that they can have sexual relations with them. Now you're probably thinking it says, bring them out that we may know them. In Hebrew it's the word yadah, which very often, and you can take my word for it or you can learn Hebrew yourself, it means sexual connotation. It does mean to know, but depending on how it's used contextually, it does mean to have sexual relations. And basically, in this case, all you have to do is keep reading, and it's blatantly obvious that that's exactly what they meant. So we're going to scroll down here to verse 5. So let's visualize this in our mind. Lot has prepared a meal. He has fed these two angels who are assumed to be men. The people of the city find out. The men come and they demand from Lot that he allows these two supposed gentlemen to come out so that they can basically have sex with them, which is a very bizarre and wicked thing to demand. If you study extra biblical writings about Sodom, you will see that sexual perversion and sexual immorality was a very prominent thing in the city. Another thing was they were known for their lack of hospitality. We looked at Ezekiel last week that talks about the sin and the iniquity of Sodom. And it says that they strengthened not the hand of the poor and needy. There was abundance of idleness, fullness of bread, which talks about greed. They were not hospitable. But also they committed abominations. And that's why the Lord ultimately destroyed them. When you look at some of the extra biblical writings, it says that when visitors would come to the city, that they would put gold in their hand or silver in their hand, and then everyone in the city would make an agreement that no one would feed them or shelter them, and they would watch them starve to death and just commit heinous crimes of no compassion whatsoever towards anyone who would come to the city. Now, this could be seen because, remember in chapter 18, and we'll see it echoed here again in a moment, that when Yahweh came down, he told Abraham, I've come down to see if Sodom has done according to their cry. And if so, I'm going to bring judgment. Now, the coming down language is judgment language. So you have these men who are very wicked wanting to commit this gang rape, if you will. Let's just be frank, that's what they're wanting to do with these two men. But watch what happens. And Lot went out at the door unto them and shut the door after him. So he steps out of the door, closes the door behind him, and he's talking with the men who he knows of the city. Now, obviously, he knows what they're up to because he lives in the city. Okay, so he's aware of how wicked they are, which kind of makes us ask the question, why would Lot stay in a place like this? I think we'll see some clues and get some answers as we read along. But basically he says in verse 7, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Now, would he make that statement to them if to know them just simply meant bring them out so we can have a conversation, so we can know who they are? Is that wicked? Absolutely not. So it's very plain and very, there's no argument against the fact that they are wanting to have a sexual relationship of some sort with these individuals. But watch his proposal. He says, don't do so wickedly. Behold now, I have 2 daughters, which have not known man. Okay? Which means I have 2 virgin girls. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. only unto these men do nothing, for therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. Now it's really undeniable in his statement that these men were wanting to have sexual relations with these two men. Because what he offers in replace of these two men is his two virgin daughters. And so we're left scratching our heads wondering, what kind of guy is Lot that would offer his two virgin daughters to the inhabitants of the city? So you have to ask questions like, did he know that they would decline? Because obviously he had raised his daughters in Sodom for some time. They would have known his daughters. And, there's a lot of questions that we could ask. Why would he give his daughters in exchange for these two strangers? I mean, if we was to put ourselves in his shoes, I think we would be more willing to offer two strangers to be defiled than our own flesh and blood, you would think. So obviously there's more going on than what's said and what we may understand, so I don't want to read too far into it. But it is a very strange proposal for him to even offer his daughters. So he feels obligated to protect these strangers, who, again, at this point, he doesn't realize they're angels. The narrator has simply told us that they are. But verse 9 says, and they said, stand back. And they said again, this one fellow came in to sojourn, which is talking about him basically coming to live there. Obviously, Lot was not from Sodom. He just chose to live there. And he needs to be a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. So they turn on Lot, who again, based on the opening verse, him being at the gate of the city, he is a prominent person in the city. And they are so driven by their immoral desires, just fleshly, out of control sexual desires, that they are upset because he will not let them in, that they basically say, okay, you won't let us have them, we'll do to you worse than what we were going to do to them. Which speaks of their wickedness as human beings. One thing that I want to point out that was brought up during our conference and is very obvious if you've ever read the book of Romans is, why are these angels come to Sodom? What did we learn in chapter 18? They have come to judge Sodom. Notice what is preceding judgment. You can't miss it. Blatant sexual immorality, and in particular, sex of the same gender. So what should we understand in our culture as Americans is about to happen? Judgment isn't about to happen. Judgment is happening. Being turned over to a mind that is so void of making the distinction between knowing to have sex with the opposite sex and the same sex is the judgment of God. It is the earlier form of divine judgment before ultimate and total destruction and annihilation. Let me say this while we're on this topic. The day of the Lord is at hand. An American can spit in God's face and think we can live how we want to, but I can tell you this, what we are seeing is the prerequisites and the latter judgment of ultimately what is coming to America and to this world. That is the eschatological day of the Lord, the return of Jesus Christ to this earth, which is going to be a day of vindication for those who are truly Christians, and it is going to be a day of calamity and destruction and utter judgment and annihilation of all of humanity that is not in a relationship with God. It's coming. Why do you think Jesus, while he was on this earth, made two analogies of the days prior to his return? What two periods of time did he allude back to as examples of what it will be like before he returns to the earth? Noah's day and Lot's day. What happened in both of those scenarios? In the self-same day, judgment came and vindication and safety for the righteous. The same day. Now, if you want to read that reference, I had thought about going to it, but for time's sake, we're not going to. But if you want to read that reference, you can go to Luke chapter 17 and notice something that is pointed out in that passage. The self-same day, the self-same day, the self-same day. All throughout the narrative. And they're actually red letters. And I think the guy who's actually going to be the one coming back would probably have some insight on how this thing's going to unfold, which tells us there will not be some pre-tribulation escapism for the church. The self-same day, the Lord will return one time and one time only. And when he does, the righteous will be resurrected. Those who are alive will be glorified and caught up to meet him on his way. But we will return immediately with him in judgment upon this world and upon this earth. It's kind of like if a king was coming to visit your town in antiquity, the inhabitants of the city would go out and meet him before he ever got to the town, but they would turn around and they would come with him and lead him as in a procession back to the city. That's exactly what the coming of the Lord is going to be like. He is going to come. He is going to bring those who have died in Christ with him, and then we're going to meet him in the air, and we are going to escort him back to this earth, in which he will bring consummation to the kingdom of God and usher in the Messianic kingdom. Okay, we just really chased a rabbit around a long ways, but it's very relevant, because what we're trying to do as we go through the book of Genesis is see the unchanging character and the ways of God. He doesn't change. Okay? So let's go back to the narrative. They said, "Now we will deal worse with you than with them," being the two men. "And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door." So they're just going to run him over and break through the door, and they're going to have their way. And they're going to get these two men. But watch what happens. I'm going to scroll back up towards the top. Verse 10. "But the men," notice that it doesn't refer to them as angels now. "But the men put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them and shut the door." So the angels understand what's going on outside the door, and they reach outside the door and they grab Lot and they pull him into safety. So they are inside and Lot's inside. But watch what else happens. Verse 11. "And they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door." So they are confused and blinded by what has taken place, which shows that the angels have supernatural power that transcends being mere humans. And Lot's probably kind of getting a clue that these aren't men at this point. "And the men said unto Lot, Have you here any besides," watch what he says, "son-in-law, and your sons, and your daughters, and whatsoever you have in the city? Bring them out of this place. For we will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxen great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord hath sent us to destroy it." I want you to pay particular attention to the question that they asked. Do you have any here besides son-in-law sons and daughters. Because when we read along, it's going to cause us to ask some more questions to see what's actually going on. Verse 14, and Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said. Now we got to stop right here before we read any further. We heard Lot mention that he had 2 daughters earlier, right? But what did he say about those 2 daughters? That they were virgins. Now, if these 2 sons-in-laws were married, if they had actually been married to his 2 daughters, they would not be virgins, would they? So we have 2 options, essentially. Lot has more daughters than the 2 virgins. He also has at least 2 daughters who are married. Or Hebrew grammar would give us the answer. How convenient. And that's exactly the case. It says, and Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which were married. The word where it says which were married doesn't say they were married. It says which were taking in present participle tense, which means it was not a completed action. His daughters. Which would indicate what? That his 2 daughters, who were virgins, were betrothed. We would say engaged to these 2 sons-in-laws. But they would carry themselves as if they were already married and the marriage had been consummated. Okay? And that is the best way to understand and harmonize basically what could be seen as conflicting information that we've read. So basically, these 2 virgin daughters were engaged to these boys. So it makes even the situation that occurred earlier even more dramatic, that Lot would be like, I'm going to give my 2 engaged virgin daughters to you guys to defile yourselves versus these 2 strangers that I don't know. It's very bizarre. But watch what happens in verse 14, which probably gives us the answer of why they respond the way they do when we read verse 14. He goes out, spake to his sons-in-laws, which had taken his daughters, which were taking his daughters, is how that should be literally translated, and said, Up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. Watch this. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. So we have to think, man, maybe they were hacked off at what he had done. In saying, hey, you can have my daughters. Because by betrothal laws of the ancient Near East at that time, it was as if they were married. Which is why you see Paul pick up this same ancient Near East principle when he says that we are espoused or we are betrothed to Christ. We are the bride of Christ, but here's the reality. We're not yet the bride of Christ because the marriage hasn't been consummated. Why do you think we have the marriage supper of the Lamb that comes into view when the Lord returns to the earth? Which is why we have to be faithful while we live out our lives unto Christ, and we can't fall in love with the things of this world because that would be committing what? Adultery. Why? Because we are betrothed. We are espoused to Christ. We are the bride of Christ, but we are not yet the bride of Christ. We are, but we aren't. It hasn't been consummated. Which speaks of intimacy. And that intimacy is literally when we are glorified as He is, and we are together, literally, in fullness with Him. And it's consummated. But they're mocking, they're laughing, which is the same Hebrew word that Isaac's name is taken from. Tzahak. And so he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. So they don't take him serious. Or they think he's playing a game or some type of a joke. Verse 15. And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, Arise, or wake up, take your wife your two daughters, which are here, lest you be consumed in the iniquity of the city. In other words, judgment is coming. The cup of iniquity is full. You see that terminology all throughout the Old Testament. God will put up with so much, but when wickedness gets to a certain level, God brings judgment. Just like we've seen, I believe, with the hurricane that hit New Orleans. I don't believe that was an arbitrary happenstance. That was the judgment of God. It's a very wicked place, and I believe that was God showing that He will bring judgment, because iniquity must be punished at some point. Now, when that point comes, is up for God to decide and determine. But it is clear, if you study the Scripture, that there is a boiling point to where the cup becomes full of iniquity, and God brings judgment. We've seen that in the vision where God spoke with Abraham and said that the iniquities of the Amorites was not yet full, but when it was, God would use the Israelites to come into the land and destroy them off the face of the earth. So we just have to understand judgment is one of the attributes of God. And He is just in bringing judgment when it is required. So they say, arise, take your wife, your two daughters, which are with you, lest you be consumed in the iniquity of the city. Verse 16, and while he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand, the angels, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his two daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him. And they brought him forth and set him without the city. Now, I want you to think about this. During the night, he goes out and tells his sons-in-law, we need to get out of here because God's going to destroy the city. But when the morning comes and the angels wake him up and say, hey, let's get out of here, judgment's coming, he wants to linger. So we need to ask the question, why is he lingering? Why would he linger and not leave the city? Insomuch he lingered long enough that the angels had to grab him physically and escort him, his wife, and his two daughters out of the city. I believe the answer is that he had grown attached to the city, what he had there. Perhaps he was gathering his possessions and didn't want to leave them behind. He wasn't leaving in haste because he didn't want to leave his stuff behind. Be careful that we don't get so attached to this world that we come to a place to where we compromise with God because our eyes are not on God and they're on things of this world. Do you see the practical lessons we can learn in this story that we can apply to today? So the Lord being merciful unto him, and they brought him forth and set him without the city. Verse 17 at the top. And it came to pass, when they had brought them forth abroad, or outside the city, which outside the city is usually cast in a negative light. If you were cast outside the city, that's being ostracized or being punished. For example, in the Israelite community, to be outside the city means that you're unclean, you're unfit, something's wrong with you. But in this situation, being ostracized outside the city is going to prove to be a safe place because judgment is going to come upon the city. So they brought him forth abroad, and he said, escape for your life. Look not behind you, neither stay thou in all the plain. Which, if we look at our map, I believe what happened here is you have somewhere in this vicinity where the Dead Sea is, 5 cities of the plain. Remember the 5 cities that were mentioned earlier in the narrative when the kings of the east came to do battle against these 5 cities of the plain? We're going to see that 4 of them are destroyed and only 1 of them is not destroyed. But I believe that they would have been somewhere around this Dead Sea area, which is the plain. He says, escape to the mountain, lest you be consumed. The word consumed literally means to be swept away. Verse 18, and Lot said unto them, Oh, not so, my Lord. Behold, now your servant hath found grace in your sight, and you have magnified your mercy. which you have showed unto me in saving my life. And I cannot escape to the mountain, lest some evil take me and I die. I know these angels are just wanting to slap the fire out of Lot right about now. This guy is up and down. He is like a roller coaster. He can't make up his mind. I mean, they said, go to the mountain lest you be consumed. They're not going to tell him to go to the mountain if he's going to be consumed on the way. So he's kind of confused, and I'm confused about Lot at this point. What is going on in this guy's mind? And who does he think he is to say, hey, let me just ask a favor of you since you've saved my life? I mean, this is really bizarre. Verse 20, he said, behold now, this city is near to flee unto. There's one city that's left in the plain that is near, and it is a little one. Oh, let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live. In other words, he's saying, can I go to this city and you not destroy this city? Because it's just a little city? And so it just seems really out of place that he's running for his life, escaping because judgment's going to come, and he's bargaining with these angels about, don't make me go up into the mountain. Let me go into this little bitty city here, and you won't destroy this little bitty city because it's a little bitty city. Now watch what happens. What's even more bizarre is when we read on verse 21, and he said unto him, see, I have accepted thee concerning this thing also. They actually grant his request. And I think we're going to see the answer to why here in just a moment. Because there's a righteous old man who had walked with Yahweh to the Judean mountains and was overlooking this plain, who was interceding on his behalf. This tells us the power of intercessory prayer for our loved ones, so don't miss this as we read along. He said, see, I've accepted thee concerning this thing also, that I will not overthrow this city for the which you have spoken. Verse 21. We're going to scroll up. Verse 22. So they grant his request. Haste thee, escape thither, for I cannot do anything till you become there. Did you hear what they said? They had no choice but to grant his request. We can't destroy anything until you go into the city, which we said would be okay and would be safe. Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar, which means little, because it was a little city. What was the name of the city before it was Zoar? We read it a couple chapters ago. Bela. Bela. Now, verse 23, the sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone, or sulfur, and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain. Which cities? Which cities? How many cities were in the plain? 5. One would not be destroyed, Bela or Zoar. What were the other cities? It doesn't mention it in this passage, but it told us earlier on in the Battle of the Kings. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim. Those 4 cities would be destroyed. So back to verse 25. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the city and that which grew upon the ground. That's important to note that, because this imagery is borrowed again in Revelation when it talks about the destruction of vegetation and things connected to sustenance of the earth. So everything was destroyed by sulfur and fire. Now, we can only speculate as to what form this took place. Did God actually dump out sulfur and fire from heaven? Was this volcano? What happened? Really, all we can do is speculate. I'm sure there's some scientific theories that are trying to be proposed, but the text doesn't really explain the details, the minute details of it. But all we do know is that the cities were destroyed, minus Zoar. And I believe that's a result, the destruction of the cities of the Kikar, the plain, I believe are a result of the lowest place on earth, which is now called the Dead Sea. I believe that if we could go under the waters of the Dead Sea and investigate, I believe there would be cities that we could find remains of civilization under those cities in some form of what was once these 4 cities of the plain. So he overthrew the cities and all the plain, all the inhabitants, and that which grew upon the ground. Verse 26. But his wife doesn't name her. There's an old proverb that says, the name of the wicked shall rot. And that principle is seen here. But his wife looked back from behind him. Remember, he warned not to, right? The angel warned not to. And she became a pillar of salt. She died, essentially. And Abraham got up early, and it kind of changes the flow of this narrative. And Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord, which presumably would be up here on one of the mountains where he had walked with the Lord to. And he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. Total destruction. That is exactly how it's going to be when the Lord returns upon those who are not safe in relationship with God. And it came to pass, verse 29, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham. Why do you think Lot was preserved? Because he was righteous? I think it's been very evident that Lot was not as righteous as Abraham. That's very safe to say. But it says, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he had overthrew the cities in which Lot dwelt. So why did God save Lot? Because of a righteous man interceding. I think I remember reading somewhere in the book of James where it says, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. It's always been that way, and it always will be. You have the right to intercede for your family. Paul talks about in his writings to the church at Corinth that how our household is sanctified, set apart because of our righteousness. And I think that's something we need to understand, and we need to put some prayer to that principle, and we need to cling to God despite what we see. I mean, Lot obviously was living in a wicked city and obviously had compromised in many ways, but because of Abraham's faithfulness in prayer and to intercede, he was saved. And 2 of his daughters as well. Now, the wife wasn't, which shows us that we can intercede, but they have to respond as well. They have a part to play. We as humans will never give up the right to have a free will. God will not force us to do anything, but it still shows us the power of prayer. Verse 30. And Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountain. I thought you wanted to be in Zoar. Now he actually goes to the mountain where he was commanded to originally. And his 2 daughters with him. Watch this. Watch the reasoning though. I just want to reach through into the Bible and just slap Lot around, right? For he feared to dwell in Zoar. And he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. So he's like, well, God destroyed the other 4 cities. Maybe he's going to go ahead and destroy this city, even though they said he won't. And he goes ahead and goes to the mountain. So he finds a cave, and I believe undoubtedly as they've left the city, that in their minds, in Lot's mind and his two daughters, they think everything's been destroyed. All they see is smoke and fire and destruction. And in their minds, they could easily believe, we're the only ones left. God's killed everybody. Now watch what happens. Verse 31. And the firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. Now, what would make them want to do something like this? The most logical explanation would be they think everybody's been killed. Obviously, the guys that they were engaged to, they're up in smoke. Mom's up in smoke. It's just them and Dad. And so they come up with this plan that we'll get Dad drunk, we'll have sex with him, and we'll bear children to him so that we can preserve seed unto him. We, in our culture, think this is absolutely bizarre and hideous. And certainly I believe that God would see it that way as well. In antiquity, it wouldn't have been as bizarre or heinous to them because they married closer. But certainly a father-daughter relationship would be very extreme. So really, I believe the only explanation that would justify what they're doing is they believe that everyone has been destroyed and they're the only ones alive. We can only guess, but that would be my proposal. Verse 33, And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. So they got him good and drunk. Now, what's amazing is this story mirrors the story of Noah in a very ironic way. Noah was a righteous man, preserved by God. Once he's preserved, once the destruction hits the earth, he gets off the ark, plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and that leads to sexual immorality, which brings a curse, which creates a huge problem moving forward in the narrative of Genesis. The same thing is happening here. And what's amazing is Jesus refers back to both of these periods. And so you have this element of duplication, mirroring what happened. So he gets drunk, and she goes in, and he didn't know when he was so drunk, he didn't know when she came in and when she left. He didn't know what happened that night. And so what happens, verse 34, And it came to pass on the morrow that the firstborn said unto the younger, Behold, I lay yesternight with my father. Let us make him drink wine this night also. And go thou in and lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. So she's like, hey, our plan worked last night. Let's get him drunk again tonight. And you can lay with him and we'll preserve seed of the father. Now, some questions need to be asked. Where do they get that much wine? Reckon that's what he was trying to gather before they left the city? He's like, I've been brewing this wine for some time. Now I'm taking it with me. Because they're in a cave. They think everybody's dead. But somehow, magically, they have this large amount of intoxicating drink, and they get Dad drunk and have sex with Dad. And the next night, the younger sister gets him drunk again because he don't remember what happened the night before. And she lies with him. It's amazing that the two individuals that he offers to be defiled by the mob in Sodom are defiled by none other than him himself. That's pretty strong. This would be where King David and his musicians would say, Selah. Stop and think about that for just a moment. his willingness to compromise the day before has led to them being defiled by none other than himself. Pretty crazy twist to the story, if you ask me. Verse 35. And they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him. And he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. Now you have to understand why it would have been so easy for Dad to be willing to get stone cold drunk so much that he passed out and they could have sex with him. What is the logical explanation? Everybody he knows other than his two daughters has just been destroyed. How are we going to cope with this? Well, I think we'll just get drunk. That's what they do. Verse 36. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. Man, what a plan that works exactly how you want it to. What's the chances of that happening? Two virgins getting their father drunk, sleeping with him back-to-back nights, and both of them happen to be cycling at the right time of the month so that both of them get impregnated by their father. Pretty crazy. Pretty crazy. Why is this part of the story important? Let's finish reading it and I'll explain. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. The firstborn bare a son and called his name Moab, which means from father. From the father. You think? The same is the father of the Moabites unto this day. And the younger, she also bare a son and called his name Ben-Ami, son of my people. The same is the father of the children of Ammon, unto this day. Why would that statement be relevant to the audience this was written to? Because the audience this was written to was the Israelites, descendants of Abraham, who were being brought out by the Exodus. And the way they would enter the land is they would come up through Edom, which would be descendants of Esau, by the Moabites, which would be the descendants of Lot through this ancestral relationship. And further to the north, you have the Ammonites. They would be people groups that would develop and evolve and grow over time from this story forward, while the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, are in Egypt, developing and growing into a nation. These are growing into people group and a nation as well, which will become opponents of the chosen people of God when they are on their way to the land that was promised to them. So just as the Canaanites were important to be pointed out earlier in the narrative in Genesis as people groups, so are the Moabites and the Ammonites, because they will be people groups of which the Israelites will have excessive interaction with moving forward throughout history and in relation with the Israelites. So it shows you basically the polemic. Again, I hate to use that word, but it's true. The polemic against the other people groups of which the Israelites will encounter, which will justify them in why they are the elect of God and why they need to do what they need to do as God commands. We're going to stop right there. Next week, we'll continue in chapter 20. We'll get back to the promise that was given to Sarah in chapter 17 and 18. First to Abraham in 17 and Sarah in 18. And we'll get back to focusing on the descendants of Abraham. But for right now, before we leave, I want to give you an opportunity to ask any questions about this really twisting and turning narrative that we have just read. Any questions? Yes, that principle is traced back to this story. But to be clear, homosexuality was not the only sexual perversion in the city. When you read the extra biblical writings, it is said that when visitors came to the city, they would bring a bed out into the streets and they would tie the visitor down and they would essentially gang rape the visitor, whether it be male or female. They also had annual feast, kind of like Israel had feast of the Lord. They had customary feast where they would have orgies and wife swapping and things like that. We shake our heads, but that goes on here in America more than you would ever believe. You'd be surprised if it was to be said with definitiveness how many people and who they were that were swingers. That's the term that's used in our culture. Who were swingers, who go to these sexual orgy parties and they swap wives, husbands and wives. You would be appalled and you would be shocked of who in this town is involved in that. Yeah, in little old Stigler, you would be blown away. Trust me. It goes on, and that's what I'm telling you guys. We can spit in God's face, we can kill babies, we can think we can do all kind of sexual immorality that we want to do, and things are just going to continue forever, but they're not. One day, the heavens are going to be rolled back like a scroll. There's going to be the final trumpet that will ever sound, and God himself is going to come to planet Earth. And when he comes down, he's bringing judgment with him. And it's over. There is no getting saved in the millennial kingdom, contrary to some of the popular dispensational teachings out there. That's not what Jesus taught, and that's not what the Bible taught. When the trumpet sounds, it's over. You're in or out. You're saved or not. You're in the ark or you're drowning. When that day comes, it is a day of salvation and a day of judgment.
Was the location of all 5 cities in the sort of southern Jericho, Dead Sea area?
Yes, if we look at the map here, this is the modern Dead Sea, but you see that there's kind of a cyclical pattern here. Now, obviously, I believe with the destruction, the topography would have changed dramatically because you would have had a radical sinking of the region because of the destruction, which I believe has resulted in the Dead Sea and it being the lowest place on earth. So there was probably a lot that took place topographically than what's explained in the text. I mean, if you have violent destruction as depicted there with fire and sulfur, brimstone activity, you're going to have the changing of topography. So perhaps at one time it was higher there in that area. Undoubtedly it was. But yeah, I believe somewhere in that whole region there, the 5 cities of the plain would have been located. There has not been any archaeological evidence that has been unearthed around the Dead Sea that would show that there was civilized, established, what we would call towns or cities in the vicinity around, which leads us to believe that it would be somewhere underneath what is there today, the Dead Sea. Yeah, the remains would be underneath the Dead Sea. Perhaps you'll notice in this map, this is a relatively current map. It's dried up even more right here. It's just a little strip now. But as this continues to dry up, at some point, if this does dry up, which it is right now in the process of doing, if what a lot of scholars believe that these cities were on the southern end of what is the Dead Sea, then we should be able to find some evidence. If they do not find, then, but then again, was the destruction catastrophic enough that there will be no remains? Is that possible? Perhaps. So, there's a lot of unanswered questions there, and we may not ever find satisfactory answers.
Even if it were to dry up, I know that there's at least a mile of minerals underneath that, so it would take a while. Probably not even our lifetime anyways.
Yeah.
So,
Did you guys hear what he said?
no.
There's a mile depth of mineral deposit and build up there at the southern slope of the Dead Sea, which would have to be unearthed. So the likelihood of that ever being done in our lifetime is highly not probable, because they're making a killing off of the stuff that they're digging up there. So they're not in a hurry to just dig it all up and get it out of the way so they can do archaeology. Because, money's more important in the world we live in than finding archaeological discoveries. That's for sure.
Keeps life in the bay, too.
Any other questions? Okay.
So it appears that, because these will be the areas where the giants will eventually be as well, correct?
The giants will be all through. This map doesn't go far enough north, but all through this region here there were giants, and then along the Gaza Strip, and even in the mountains here in the southern Negev, all surrounding the land that was promised. Surrounding and in the land there were giants that had to be conquered by the Israelites.
But the sexual immorality, they didn't learn from this episode. It just carries over.
I am of the belief that there was some divine interaction that led to this degree of sexual immorality and perversion.
In Sodom and
Yes,
even?
in Sodom and Gomorrah. And the reason why I believe that, and that's a good question, is because Jude and Peter both talk about the sin of the angels that fell, and in both of those writings, Peter's writing and Jude, they parallel what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah with the sin of the angels that fell, which we know is the sin of the watchers procreating with humans. So I do believe that there was a extraterrestrial influence in these cities, not extraterrestrial in what you see on TV, but divine beings, angelic beings that were in rebellion and defiance against God, who led to some of the knowledge and some of the corruption that we see that ultimately led to destruction. Because they certainly were involved in the Amorites. That's clear. Because the Amorites, that was another word that was used to articulate giants. These beings that were a product of the sons of God, divine beings, and the daughters of man, human beings. So yes, I do believe there was a divine influence in their immorality. The text doesn't come out and say it in the Old Testament, but like I said, Peter and Jude.
So the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is supposed to be a foreshadowing of judgment, right? The end of judgment. The question concerning salvation then, because Lot was saved on Abraham's behalf. So, two questions. Was Lot a righteous enough man? Because if we're comparing him to Noah, we know Noah wasn't perfect either. But also, I think of, the scripture about saving you and your household. It makes me think of that again. He was saved on Abraham's behalf.
Yeah, I believe that one of the important notes is what we read earlier, that Abraham had been interceding for him, but also in the New Testament we have passages that say that Lot was righteous. Matter of fact, it says that righteous Lot, his soul was vexed from day to day because of the immorality in Sodom. Now, he still chose to stay there, though, which is what I don't get. But evidently, we'd call him today, he's barely saved. He's barely saved. Evidently, his wife wasn't saved enough because she got smoked. But the New Testament does cast him as being righteous, even though when we look at him compared to Abraham, he's not as righteous. But the New Testament says he was righteous enough to escape.
Well, I think you said that about his wife. I think the main difference there is that, Lot's trying to give his daughters to the people. Like, he obviously had some big mistakes he was making, but he didn't really ever disobey God. He pleaded with God, and he kind of changed the plan. We see Abraham do the same thing with Ishmael, but his wife directly, deliberately disobeyed. So,
Yeah. His wife directly, defiantly did something that was commanded not to do. The angel said, do not look behind you. And you see Jesus pick up some of the same imagery, like I said earlier. Go and read Luke 17, because he talks about his return being like the days of Noah and the days of Lot. And he says in that discourse, when that day comes, don't be worried about going in your house and getting your stuff. And basically that's a warning about getting too attached to this world, loving this world, which is exactly the picture that John paints in the book of Revelation. You have those who love the world and those who love Christ. You can't do both. That's why John says in his little writings, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So you have to make a decision. And obviously there were struggles in that area with Lot and his family, as every generation, with loving God or the world, what the world has to offer.
What do you think kept the men of the city from bothering Lot?
Say that again?
What do you think kept the men of the city from bothering Lot
Bothering Lot.
sexually?
Good question.
that's what they did.
Reckon those.
You mean when he came to the city originally? He was wealthy. And a lot of times wealth can,
Power.
empower you. The text doesn't say, so we can only guess or assume. But he was a prominent person in the city for him to be at the gate like that.
What about the two sons-in-law?
The two sons-in-laws went up in smoke because they thought
Well, I know.
it's just a game. And I mean, you have to somewhat be empathetic towards them, because can you blame them for not taking Lot seriously? I mean, who offers crazy men wanting to have sex with men, their daughters? I mean,
I think they were just vile and evil.
they were.
Yeah, and I think and that sort of, she was wondering, I think she meant why they didn't want to have sex with the sons-in-law, is that what you're
Yeah.
saying? Because it was, they wanted new people that came in, the visitors.
I don't know.
I read the back of the book, no.
You said it was standard practice that a visitor.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to
In extra biblical writings,
say. Thank you.
when visitors came to their city, they wanted to exploit them in every way possible. Sexually, they wanted them to starve to death. One extra biblical writing talks about them dipping someone in honey and tying them to a bed and leaving them out in the street. I mean, just bizarre things, which, we don't take it as authoritative scripture, but it's very plausible, because their cry went up to the Lord so much that he came down to bring judgment. So, Derek?
Verse 17. Unless I'm thinking too hard, something interesting happened in that verse. From the first verse through 17, the angels are always referred to in the plural as we, they, or the men. In 17 it said, so it came to pass when they, which were the angels, had brought them outside, and then it goes to the singular, that he said, And from that point on, all the way through 30, like for 21, it said, and he said to him, see, I have favored you concerning this, and that I will not overthrow the city. So my question to you is that in my studies, I didn't get to study this out. In 18, verse 18, Lot said to them, please know my lords. And in what I was looking at the other day, it said that in most translations, they use the plural lords, but that this is the same address Abraham used earlier to the embodied Yahweh. So I'm wondering, is 18 saying, is this where the Lord, where the angels, did the Lord show up and the angels go off in that one verse in 17? Because it refers to the singular person the rest of the time.
No, I believe it's just showing that you had one angel being the spokesman of the two. There's nothing in the text grammatically in the Hebrew that shows a shifting or changing, because you have two angels that are there throughout the whole events, but then you have one that primarily does the speaking from a certain point forward, which would make sense that they both weren't speaking. The address as Lord Adonai is not the sacred name. It's just a polite address that you would say to even another human being, sir. So there's nothing that would hint that Yahweh's there, because remember in chapter 18 that it said that Yahweh left from talking with Abraham and he didn't go down to Sodom.
Right.
So he's nowhere there carrying out the judgment. And earlier in this narrative, the angel says that, he has been sent to bring judgment upon the city, and as the executor in carrying it out, or at least getting the righteous out of the city.
Yeah.
But that's a good pickup to see person change in a narrative, because that usually does indicate something important. So keep looking for things like that. That is a really, really smart thing to do. You will run onto a lot of nuggets and gems if you pay attention to the grammar and first person, third person changing and things like that. So that is a good find. I don't think there's anything there in this situation, but a lot of times there would be.
My footnote says in the Septuagint, Syriac, and Vulgate, it reads they.
Yeah, there's variant readings that would read other ways. Because here in verse 18, and Lot said unto them, so he's still talking to them, even though he says, oh, not so, my Lord, he would be speaking to them, but addressing the one who he's actually carrying the conversation with.
Not them being the embodied Yahweh of all.
Yeah, these are these angelic beings. Melachim is the Malachim, which we kind of have a blurred understanding of what that looks like in our minds because of all the stuff about angels with wings and stuff like that. Clearly, they look like men, human beings.
Not to kick it a dead horse, but like in 21, where it says, and he said to him, see, I have favored you concerning this, and that I will not overthrow the city. Are you saying that the angel is given that power to be that?
He's speaking on behalf of God.
Of God.
He's speaking with the authority. Like I said, that is a good find, because you have the angel Yahweh, Malach Yahweh, who is present in a lot of scenes, especially like Exodus chapter 3, where he speaks on behalf of God and he speaks as God, or Yahweh. So it is important to notice changes like that. Any other questions?
Could you explain a little bit you said did on the yada, on the known, that you said very important context, obviously. What context change with that same word? Is that, you teach about praise, isn't that the same?
No, this is a different word. It sounds similar. It's Yud Dalet Ein versus Yud Dalet Hey. So you have a different consonant that's used in that word. The word Yada that is used in this passage, which obviously means sexually, to know sexually, normally 95% of the time would mean to know, like to have knowledge of, to know. But this context, I mean, it makes it pretty irrefutable that they're talking sexually. And there's other examples that we'll read, especially in Genesis, where that particular verb is used in the context of sexual relationship, intercourse.
So it's actually a different word, spelled different.
Then yada, when you speak of praise, yeah, that's a totally different word. Different roots, different base, yeah. Sounds the same to us, but the spelling is totally different. Any other questions? Bates, you have one more? You sure?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You said that the Lot defiled, at the end there, Lot defiled his daughters, because the descendants of the Moabites, the women later on went and caused so much havoc. I'm just wondering if it could be the other way around. Could it be the daughters did that to him and had that spirit about them, which caused them, to seduce God's people with immorality and stuff later on?
Later on in Numbers. I mean, you have things that are passed down generationally. Obviously, you have children who are a byproduct of incest. And they were not the elect. They were not, under the covenant that was given to Israel. So they're kind of outsiders. So it would be very plausible to see that they would be a thorn in their side later on.
Would it be a curse for that, for incest? That the descendants would...
It doesn't say there's a curse.
Right.
I mean, I think it would be argued in scholarship whether or not you could view it as a curse. It certainly isn't a positive thing. It's not cast in a positive light, clearly, because again, this text was written to the Israelites, and mentioning this is polemic against, hey, we're inferior, we're better than the Ammonites and the Moabites, we're the chosen of God, the elect of God. So clearly it's cast in a negative light, what happens here. Anybody else?